Hong Kong, a bustling city and international hub, distinguished largely by its economic influence worldwide. But how has this place evolved to become what we know as today? To understand this, one must first rewind back to the one event that started it all. Early 19th century proved to be a major period of time for the growth of Hong Kong and Canton. This was the name of present-day Guangdong. Prior to the arrival of the British, Canton mainly consisted of small indigenous groups, relying primarily on their fishing industry for income. British citizens began to develop an interest and taste for tea. With Canton as a gem of China's trade, their plentiful production of silk and tea were widely sought by foreign traders. Despite their unified tastes, the desire for trade was one-sided. The Chinese's refusal to comply took the form of a combination of strict policies against foreign trade as well as a lack of interest in what the British had offered. However, there was one thing that the British had that would be of interest to the Chinese: opium. First of all, what exactly is opium? Well, it is a type of dried latex extracted from the opium poppy that had been used as a painkiller for over 100 years in China, but was banned for other purposes due to its addictive properties. Despite this, the illegal recreational use of opium grew dramatically as a result of the First Opium War between Britain and China. It all started in the year of 1839, as thousands of Chinese became addicted to the opium that the British had illegally exported from India.
Was it in the spring of 1839, a man named Lin Zexu, known to the foreigners as Commissioner Lin, ordered the foreigners who were in the city of Canton, Guangzhou, to surrender their opium. Right? In the end, I believe it was about 20,000 chests of opium that were surrendered. And then shortly after that, Mr. Lin destroyed the opium.
The capture of Nanking by the British put an end to the war, ending with the Treaty of Nanking. The treaty was signed on August 29th, stating multiple agreements in the British favor. The two major negotiations state that Hong Kong Island now belongs to the British. Along with that, the number of treaty ports increased from 1, which was Canton, to 5. With increased use of opium came increased illegal activity, seeing as opium trade was banned, but the addicted Chinese citizens inevitably desired the drug, unfortunately also causing decline of health. Disputes between the British and the underpowered Chinese were ignited, causing many casualties. 20,000 Chinese were killed, and if the deaths themselves were not enough, further cultural tension occurred. The century-long rule of the British caused Hong Kong to face two main cultural dilemmas. The first one related to the communications. Since the official spoken language of Cantonese and written language English form language barriers, the second lies with the nature of the justice system, wherein British systems of trial are determined by a jury. Chinese communist systems are without a jury, and Hong Kong was caught between the two. It is hard to pinpoint a sole antagonist of the war, however, when both sides had their own share of wrongdoings.
Lots of people were making money off the opium, right? British traders, foreign traders, Chinese traders, government officials who just kind of turned a blind eye as long as they got paid for it. So a lot of people had a vested interest in opium.
It was only when Chinese intellectuals later realized that in order to beat the Western forces, they would have to first understand their beliefs, and that they began to read translated material about Western political ideas and their economy. There were many political impacts on Hong Kong and China. In the past, China did not have a strong relationship with the Western world and had little contact with the West due to natural and political barriers. China's views on the Western world only slowly began to change when the West turned to China for spices. When opium was being sold to China for medicinal purposes, China began to appreciate the West as trade with the West opened up in the early 16th century. But still, foreigners involved in trade were still frowned upon. The Opium Wars also led to strong British influence and a change in the main power.
I mentioned that Hong Kong was always valued as an entry point to China rather than a thing in itself. During the 1920s and 30s, Shanghai was far more important to the British than Hong Kong was. As this is happening, Hong Kong goes from being a very marginal, not very well-known colony to being, by the late 60s, far and away the most important remaining colony of the British.
The Opium Wars also helped open Hong Kong to other countries, which improved interactions and relations. It is without a doubt that the most significant changes that Hong Kong had experienced was its massive expansion in economics. Before the Opium War occurred, tension in foreign trade relations between Britain and China were apparent. The British were unhappy with the strict trade relations imposed in Canton, as well as the arrogant assumption of supremacy by the Chinese. In December 1834, discussions between the British concerning the position of the foreigners in Canton arose the question of securing an island or islands off the Chinese coast to replace Canton as a center of trade. These were the first debates of which the desirability of occupying Hong Kong were exhibited, due to its convenient location for commercial intercourse, good harbors, national facilities for defense, and easy provision.
They come to Canton in the 1600s because that's the port that's open, right? It's one of the ports that opens. So there's kind of a natural connection there. What we can say, without any question, is that colonization put Hong Kong into the world's economic map in a way it had never been before.
Hong Kong's first steps towards being an entrepot of trade came in proclamation dated January 29, 1841, made by Captain Elliot. It is imposed that all Chinese trade was to be exempted from any charge or duty of any kind to the British government. This gave way for the Chinese and foreign merchants to regard the island as a center of trade by becoming a permanent trading station. This free trade policy, along with a multilateral trading system, is what has made Hong Kong one of the world's largest trading economies. Although introduced centuries before, the policy is still in place today, holding no tariff on imports, except for some luxury items such as motor vehicles. Hong Kong, even today, is dependent upon imported products, which make up about half of the total amount of external trade. Needless to say, Hong Kong has the First Opium War to thank for contributing to its development into a successful international financial and commercial center, serving the Asia-Pacific region and mainland China.
Ever since the British colonized the small city in southern China called Hong Kong, the city was under influence by both Chinese and British powers, causing political tension in the small territory. As the Communist Party's power grew, control was extended to the edges of the country, including Hong Kong. Despite being a colony, the Chinese Communist Party continued to influence the city socio-economically, through propaganda, and politically, through the party's presence in the Hong Kong politics. After overthrowing the monarchy system imposed by the Qing dynasty in the Xinhai Revolution of 1911, the Kuomintang Party led by Sun Yat-sen established a republican government over southern China, which was expanded to the north in 1928. The party itself held to political beliefs of anti-communist and, most importantly, anti-foreign ideals. At this time, Hong Kong was a British colony that acted as an economic port for international trade, yet, with the rise of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921, with party members inspired by ideals of Marxism-Leninism, the Communist Party led to the Chinese Civil War that broke out from 1945 to 1949 between them for control of the nation. With assistance from the communist government in the USSR, the Chinese Communist Party slowly gained control of China and furthered their political influence into the then still politically stable British colony of Hong Kong. Following World War II, the Chinese Communist Party and Kuomintang broke out into a 3-year-long civil war as a result of their unresolved conflicts from the past. During that time period, Hong Kong was a haven for civilians fleeing from the mainland China, especially those labeled as black families, which include landlords, rich farmers, anti-revolutionists, and capitalists. Additionally, many Kuomintang supporters from all over China escaped to different places, and many came to Hong Kong. From 1949, the Hong Kong population grew from 1.86 million to 2.8 million in 1957.
We know after the Chinese Civil War and after the establishment of the People's Republic of China in October 1949, huge numbers of people came from China to Hong Kong, sometimes several hundred per day.
中國而嚟香港就兩個問題㗎啦。第一個問題咧就係、中國大陸就第二次大戰之後咧就因為上邊嘅社會有內戰啦，就變咗社會就唔得安定，可能上邊就咁好多人咧就走嚟香港啊，咁有好多人嚟係。差唔多嘅難民咁噶嘛，唔係有一部分人咧就嚟到訂要揾嘢做，又冇咁多工作俾佢做啊嘛。咁呢個一方面，咁另外一方面咧又比較積極啲好處喎，因為好多咧喺中國啊做生意啊做工業啊嗰啲人咧，就有啲人咧就帶啲財富嚟又有，同埋帶啲工業嘅知識嚟又有。對於香港咧，就係工業咧就好大幫助嘅。
Many refugees lived in small huts priced at 14 Hong Kong dollars a month, with limited food supplies. However, for those who could not crowd into the congested slum dwellings, lived in temporary house shacks made of discarded matchboarding, old sacking, and kerosene tents on the mountainsides, but still thousands of refugees slept on the streets. Despite difficulties posed by the refugee situation, Hong Kong also had economic benefits from its social circumstances, as the mainland China was attracted to the stability of Hong Kong.
1951年咧，你過呢度過元旦嘅，咁啊坐火車由上海到廣州，經過38個小時應該到達廣州嘅咁樣。喺深圳過關嗰陣時咧，當時咧因為由於中國同香港嘅邊境咧，即係都未有一定嘅規定，即係申請啲乜嘢啊，就隨便過嚟嘅。
The Chinese Communist Party have always had party members present in Hong Kong's politics, using Hong Kong's liberal political environment as a strategy against Kuomintang.
I would say that for the most part they tried to keep a rather hands-off approach to Hong Kong. Right? The reason that they kept Hong Kong, they allowed the British to keep Hong Kong as a colony, was partly because they got so much out of Hong Kong.
After the Civil War, the US banned financial transactions to China because of their involvement in the Korean War, but resources continued to flow in from Hong Kong.
A lot of them moved into jobs that local people might not necessarily take. And as you may also know, in the 50s and 60s, Hong Kong was starting its own, I wouldn't call it an industrial revolution, but kind of a manufacturing revolution.
Persecution from the Communist Party that caused the exodus of people from the mainland was one of the greatest factors of Hong Kong's economic growth between the 1950s and 60s. Many of those who migrated to Hong Kong were Democrats and entrepreneurs who invested a lot into Hong Kong's economy. This opened up a lot of jobs for other refugees. Hong Kong began as a manufacturing city, and as generations passed, an increasing number of people began looking for higher class jobs.
一嚟到咧，見到有咁樣嘅豐衣足食咧，就相當之好滿意啦。即係嗰陣時唔計夠人工嘅，只有個三餐食到已經好滿足㗎啦，因為即係咁啦，應該好開心。
As a whole, through China's historical development through the 20th century, the occurrence of the Civil War and the establishment of the Chinese Communist Party has certainly restructured Hong Kong's social, economic, and political circumstances to a great extent, where the economy in Hong Kong is allowed to prosper in spite of the sense of political instability that exists within the metropolitan city.
Ever since the end of the Russian-Japanese War of 1904, in which Japan, an East Asian nation, had emerged victorious against a major European power, the West had become suspicious of Japan's increasingly militaristic imperialist ambitions. By the 1930s, however, it was clear that the Japanese were intent on expanding their empire through whatever means possible, unequal treaties, sabotage, and wars of conquest, to name a few. By annexing Manchuria in 1931, the Japanese had enlarged their empire to an entirely new height. Following these annexations, the world criticized. The Chinese protested, and the long-brewing tensions between China and Japan eventually culminated into full-scale war following the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937. For 4 years, Republican China continued the conflict with Imperial Japan, and as Japanese forces drew closer to Canton coastline, the British looked on wearily from their colonies in the east, bracing themselves for the invasion to come. Surely enough, in 1941, the Japanese assaulted a series of major offensives against the British, Dutch, and Americans, and Hong Kong was amongst the first locations hit. December the 8th, 1941. At 6 a.m., Lieutenant General Takashi Sakai of the Imperial Japanese Army receives a telegram from Tokyo. The Japanese invasion began on December 8, 1941, a day after the attack on Pearl Harbor. On the first day of the invasion, the Japanese Air Force bombed Hong Kong. At exactly 8 a.m. in the morning of December the 8th, 1941, a Japanese invasion force numbering some 52,000 men strong, under the command of Lieutenant General Takashi Sakai, crosses the border into the new territories, under the cover of air support and artillery fire. Meanwhile, their British counterparts pale in comparison, numbering a mere 14,000 men. The Hong Kong garrison is outnumbered almost 4-1, with non-existent air support after the bombing of Kai-Tak Airport by the Japanese Air Force. Naval defenses also prove useless, as the majority of ships are destroyed within a few days of bombing. With the abandonment of Kowloon and the new territories came the bombardment. Japanese artillery positions pounded Hong Kong relentlessly from the harbor, while the Japanese Air Force indiscriminately dropped bombs overhead. The bombings last for an entire week, during which the Japanese launched 2 invitations to surrender, one on the 13th and one on the 17th. Both are rejected.
Now, 日本人呢，阿部細個嗰陣時呢，就日本飛機嚟炸我哋中國嗰陣時呢，咁我哋媽咪呢，為帶我哋去上山嗰度呢，因為有好多樹木噶嘛。乜遮住我哋嘛，個飛機就睇唔到嘛，就飛走咗咯。好多人去匿埋㗎，咁等飛機走咗之後咧，我哋先出嚟咯。日本人真係阿部咁細個未見過喎，係得見過佢係飛機嚟炸我哋啫嘛。
With failure to negotiate a peaceful surrender, the Japanese proceeded to land on Hong Kong Island on the evening of the 18th of December 1941 at Lei Yunmen Passage. Aiming to take Lei Yunmen Fort from the British, the Japanese launched a massive assault against fort defenses, suffering only slight casualties. However, they were effectively repulsed until early morning, when they successfully overwhelmed the fort, and in retaliation for the losses suffered the previous night, executed 20 defenders, the majority of whom were local volunteers.
The disastrous loss of the Lei Yunmun fort left large areas of Hong Kong Island effectively open to Japanese capture. In response to this, British Major General Christopher Maltby, head of the Hong Kong garrison, decides to organize the defense of the island by splitting the defending forces in two, creating the East and West brigades.
Following the capture of Lei Yunmun fort, the Japanese sought to separate the two brigades by taking control of the Wong Nai Chung Gap, which links the north and south of Hong Kong Island. In response, on the 19th of December, the British and Commonwealth forces mounted a fierce defense, inflicting over 600 Japanese casualties through the effective use of defensive fortifications built prior to the battle, such as this pillbox behind me, and gun batteries, machine gun nests, and bunkers were also amongst the structures the Japanese would have had to face. However, despite the best efforts of the defenders, the Japanese were able to vanquish the colonial troops by the evening of the same day.
Hong Kong then went under occupation, where the Japanese ruled with complete and absolute authority. Then, on the 6th of August, 1945, following a successful campaign in the Pacific, the United States detonated 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The horrific results of the bombings compelled the Japanese Emperor Hirohito to seek a peaceful settlement to the war. On the 30th of August, the Japanese ceded control of Hong Kong back to the British, signing the Japanese Instrument of Surrender at Hong Kong Government House. The occupation had lasted for 3 years and 8 months.
The major Japanese surrenders takes place at Hong Kong Government House. From the flagship Duke of York comes Admiral Fraser to be present, and Vice Admiral Harcourt to preside at the signing. The historic document receives the signature of Major General Okada, who concludes his part of the ritual with the surrender of his Tumari sword to the Allied party. The second Jap to brushstroke his name is Vice Admiral Fujita. Thus, the ceremony, which means freedom for thousands of Allied prisoners, is concluded in the last stronghold of the Japanese co-prosperity sphere. Even while the documentation is in progress, the town itself is rapidly getting back to its normal routine. Thanks to victorious Allied might, a new day dawns to the outpost of empire, Hong Kong.
Kowloon Walled City, Hong Kong's greatest anomaly, a piece of history relatively unknown to the greater global public. It was once the centre of criminal activity.
Prostitution, there is a need, there's a market. Guys need prostitutes for whatever reason. So wherever there's guys, there's going to be prostitutes. It's the same all around. Gambling is very much a Chinese culture, as drinking possibly in the UK and in America is more of a culture. Gambling certainly comes through through history, and of course it's well founded into the walled city. It was part of recreation, gambling.
all aspects of the underground Hong Kong. The triads began to establish prominence in the walled city during the early 1950s. The 14K and the Sun Yi-on had the largest influence, and by 1959 they had established control of the walled city. Their income came from owning brothels, gambling parlours and opium dens, as well as drug trade and taxation on the public. By the 1980s there was an established 300,000 triads in Hong Kong. Gambling dens scattered the layout of the walled city. Fan Tan is one of the main gambling games that was played in the walled city. It dates back to 2,000 years ago with Chinese origin. In a lawless walled city run only by triads, gambling flourished. There were 30,000 people residing in the walled city. A place to start would be the triads.
I think the most prominent ones were the 14K, subsay K, and the Sun Yi-on. There were probably quite a few others. I don't know exactly how they divided up the walled city, but certainly they would have divided it up into their own territories, into their own fiefdoms, and they would have protected those fiefdoms. And that's where any violence would have occurred if one encroached on another's territory. They looked after the prostitutes, of course. They took money from gambling. They took money from the factories. They took money from the shops. And whilst if everything went fine, there was no problem. But if one triad society started to get greedy and started to encroach on somebody else's territory, that's when things would get extremely nasty.
Although the rampant crime of earlier decades diminished in later years, the walled city was still known for its high number of unlicensed doctors and dentists who could operate there without threat of prosecution. Of a horror movie, the walled city's tunnels ran deep and narrow. It was the perfect location for crime syndicates. The influx of illegal activities and the eventual realization of how much of a cancer the walled city was to Hong Kong eventually led to its destruction in 1994. But how much crime really occurred within the walls of the walled city? In the 1950s, due to the growing number of refugees pouring into the walled city from China, it became a center for drugs. Opium in particular, with no proper jurisdiction from both China and England, due to the walled city's jurisdiction being left to the Chinese government who had little care over the establishment. It became a center of operations for triad gangs to store and trade opium. Due to the growing number of walled city-related crimes and the rise in the influx of drugs in Hong Kong, the police conducted several raids in 1973 and 1974. In those 2 years, the police confiscated 1,800 kilograms of opium and made 2,500 arrests over the course of 3,500 raids. This was the beginning of the end of crime in the walled city, and by 1983, the Kowloon police commander announced that crime levels had reduced to regulated levels. Crime was present to a large extent in the walled city. As with all cities, nothing stays clean of crime for long.
Hong Kong is one of the world's leading international finance centers with low taxation and a well-established finance market. Hong Kong is known as one of the 4 Asian tigers, along with Singapore, Taiwan, and Korea. All of these cities are with high growth rates and rapid industrialization. Hong Kong has evolved enormously in the past century, starting out as a fishing village, to a military port, and later to an industrialized city, making Hong Kong become one of the best financial cities today. Notably, the industrialization during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s has benefited the economy enormously and played a significant part in the history of Hong Kong. Without it, Hong Kong won't be as successful as it is today. Going back 70 years, the Chinese Civil War fought between the Kuomintang and the Communist Party of China in the late 1940s caused huge waves of Chinese refugees migrating to flee war and famine. They hoped to start a new life in the prosperous city of Hong Kong. Hong Kong welcomed these ideologists, revolutionaries, and previous leaders from China. Peasants fled to Hong Kong to look for a new start to their lives. Hundreds of Shanghainese businesses transferred their operations to Hong Kong. Soon there were too many. Hong Kong's population began flooding, and the government was afraid. Property prices were rising faster than ever, and the Hong Kong government began limiting the number of Chinese refugees. Shortly after, in the early 1950s, the Korean War began. China allied with North Korea against South Korea, who was allied with the United Nations and the United States. The North Korean soldiers broke through the boundary between North and South Korea. The assistance of China had defeated the American army. The United States decided to reduce the amount of support China would provide Korea.
If aggression is successful in Korea, we can expect it to spread throughout Asia and Europe and to this hemisphere.
An embargo on China's trade was established. China was Hong Kong's biggest market during the time. The embargo had isolated China from the international economy. Hong Kong was not able to prosper with the embargo on China's trade, which led Hong Kong to change its economic focus into manufacturing. With China's markets closed, Hong Kong worked on industrialization. Manufacturing companies were established, giving an increased amount of working opportunities for mass refugees from China to work in Hong Kong, which significantly strengthened the economy. Large numbers of workers and cheap labor attracted many factories and capitalists to move to Hong Kong. Clothing and textile industries became the backbone of Hong Kong's manufacturing sector. Near the year 1952, Hong Kong stepped into industrialization and started to rise. Much of Hong Kong's success relied on the cheap labor from refugees, working for 16 hours a day in unsafe working conditions along with low wages. Most workers endured and some managed to make their way out of poverty. Many workers did not receive proper education, and they needed to go to work when they were very small, with approximately 50% of workers who completed primary school and more than 20% who have never studied. However, under international pressure, the Hong Kong government began to establish and enforce labor standards. Working hours were decreased and wages were raised.
我9歲就出嚟做嘢啦，冇書讀嘅。以前做嘢要好勤力先揾到錢嘅，車嗰啲女裝嘅衫咯，同埋褸啊嗰啲咯，同埋嗰啲男仔嘅 T 恤啊嗰啲咯，都係揾個零錢一日嘅咋，要好勤力先揾到嘅。以前我哋翻工嗰陣時，一日做幾份嘢，日日咁趕住趕住，嗰陣時揾工好易嘅咋，最緊要你肯做就得㗎啦。 乜嘢都有得你做，朝頭早做鐘點，晏晝就翻工，夜晚攞衫翻屋企車。
The labor-intensive jobs in the clothing and textile industry remained as the lead in the 50s and 60s. In 1960, textile industry took up almost 50% of the manufacturing sector, while the manufacturing sector took up more than 40% of the employment structure. It also became the time when the label Made in Hong Kong products became the most reliable, with the highest quality. Starting from 1960, other industries began to advance further, including toys, electronics, and watches. The number of factories had increased from 2,200 in 1950 to 16,500 in 1970, while the number of workers had increased from 98,200 in 1950 to 549,000 in 1970. The diversity of industries and large amounts of workers had contributed to domestic export value from 2.9 billion to 12.3 billion in 20 years' time, increasing approximately 18% every year. Manufacturing solely had contributed 81% of the exports. As more factories were established, land became insufficient and land rent began to rise tremendously. From 1960 to 1980, the cost of each square meter increased from just $105 to $12,000, causing several companies to close down or move out of Hong Kong. Significant changes were made to Hong Kong with all manufacturing and intensive industrialization, but unfortunately, everything comes to an end. Hong Kong has moved on to something even more advanced, progressing the country and moving its economy forward. Hong Kong began to shift to tertiary sector due to strong competition with the other three Asian tigers and newly industrializing countries, such as Thailand. The main reason also includes China's economic reforms during 1980s. Deng Xiaoping established the open door policies in which international countries were able to make trades with the rest of the world. China's economic reform allowed Hong Kong companies to relocate their industries to Guangdong, where 94% of the relocated industries moved, due to cheap labor, infrastructure, and facilities, as well as a lot of flat land for industrial development. With many industries relocating to China, the manufacturing industry began to decline, but the tertiary sector began to rise. Finance and commerce industry began to prosper in the 1990s, turning Hong Kong into the financial city we know today. A glance at Hong Kong in present day. Financial high-rises have crowded the islands of Hong Kong. Its economic states have reached unbelievable heights, and it is nearly the most international city in the world. It is hardly evident that Hong Kong has been through the 30 years of industrialization, and that the city was once a place overwhelmed by manufacturing industries. The deindustrialization has nearly erased the existence of this industry. Hong Kong is the international financial center of the world. It is a city we will live, love, and prosper forever.
The Kowloon walled city has been known as one of the densest places on Earth, as it stands as one of the most shameful structures in Hong Kong history. With a population of 50,000 people, each family lived in a 40 square foot apartment, a lawless labyrinth in the heart of Kowloon.
Ordinary, sort of good working people pretended it didn't exist. They never went there, they never talked about it, it was never mentioned. So it sort of was, the idea of it being a walled city was quite right, because if you didn't live there, you never went in. Most people would never even think of going in.
At the same time, that ingenuity was spawned by the city's isolation. There was little in the way of public services, meaning sanitation, public safety, and crime prevention. These were all the purview of locals. Heroin addiction and prostitution were rampant, and the city's citizens were mostly on their own. In 1949, refugees flooded into Hong Kong, with many drawn to Kowloon Walled City because of its cheap rent. The increase in population forced the building to rise upwards, creating the iconic structure that we see in pictures, books, museums, and parks. All that's left of it today.
But also at the same time, there were a lot of factory owners who were moving in, because they found the same rules, that they could operate a factory without government inspectors telling them you can do this, you can't do that, you can't store that here, so that they could run their place, and make without. And of course, the other thing was, of course, a lot of people coming from China were leaving China, refugees from the 50s and 60s. They wanted to get away from authority, They hated the idea of people watching them, what they were doing. So the walled city was one place they could go where they weren't observed the whole time. So they were quite happy about that.
The Qing Dynasty soldiers were defeated in 1898 by the British. They left the Longjing Pier to Lok Sin Tong, which is a charity, to manage this empty space. If there was control by the Hong Kong, British, or Chinese government to govern this area, then there wouldn't be a lawless piece of land. In the end, a lot of people went to that area to claim the Qing dynasty's buildings and land, mostly immigrants from China, to escape the communist rule under Mao Zedong. And the rich people spent money to create housing until 1992, concluding with around 350 different types of buildings. In 1988, the government wanted to remove this area. It took 4 years as each family needed to register. The government had to negotiate a compensation plan with all the families ending in 1992. Then they were willing to leave. In 1994, they agreed to destroy the Kowloon Walled City. The buildings did not have a foundation, but they kept on building upwards, and each house had 3 walls. Some people ask if we can keep a few historical buildings. But that's not possible because all the buildings were attached to each other, and if one fell, everything else would.
烏泥即係烏掹掹嘅就係泥漿扮，你就唔好叉隻腳落去啦。反光嘅就係水凼，你就唔好叉落去啦。唯一白色嘅就係石，點解咧？因為花崗石有一個好得意嘅原理，你環境越暗，佢就越白嘅。咁啊，因為呢裏邊啲街道都係用花崗石嚟鋪嘅，咁所以我夠膽入嚟。點知行下冇幾多分鐘咧，就碰到有個瞓喺街度抱住我隻腳問我攞錢嘅吸毒者。咁啊，當然係怯啦，因為你喺出邊入嚟嘅，又唔知呢度嘅環境。
Though Kowloon Walled City seemed to be an unorthodox and lawless zone, it was simply home to others. In Cantonese, they called it the City of Darkness. What makes the walled city all the more fascinating is the fact that all of its buildings were constructed without contributions from a single architect.
我喺呢度做義工之後，我先發覺我當日行嗰條就係叫做秘密通道。原來呢裏邊好多秘密通道嘅。你睇嗰幅圖，所有紅色嗰啲線全部係秘密通道，真係要穿家過戶啊！嗱，你哋出邊傳得呢度好污穢，根本呢度係一個好融洽嘅小社區嚟嘅。點解咧？佢哋真係守望相助。
When I first came to Wall City, I had no idea where I'm going to go. It's like a beehive. Thought the best way to do is actually to record the experience. And so I mark all the trails, and then I follow my markings.
我係香港大學嘅建築學院嚟嘅。
And then just recorded all the way how one can traverse up and down and across and end on the roof. It's like a big kid jungle gym that you just discover different things as you twist and turn, and then someone will say hello to you.
對唔住啊！
In the short span of 6 years, what took decades to create was destroyed after years of negotiations. The last remaining structure was destroyed in April 1994. In 1995, the government used the space to create a 61 million Hong Kong dollar park over what used to be a truly historical landmark. But yet, the truths of the Kowloon Walled City remains a mystery to many of us, as the site itself is still a myth, yet to be uncovered.
Japanese occupation of Hong Kong from 1941 to 1945 had a tremendous influence on the daily lives of Hong Kong civilians, its impact still substantial in the modern-day society. This is a story of people who lived through the time of suffering, told in different social aspects of their daily lives in these 3 years and 8 months. On Monday, December 8th in 1941, Hong Kong was attacked by Japan with a garrison of approximately 11,000 regular soldiers. Despite valiant efforts by the British and Canadian defenders, the British governor, Sir Mark Young, surrendered the colony on the afternoon at 3:30 on Christmas Day after 18 days of fierce fighting with a casualty of 1,550 defenders. When the Japanese barged into Hong Kong, little did the inhabitants know that Hong Kong would be under Japanese rule for 3 years and 8 months, with toilsomeness and many other harrowing experiences. This is Daniel, a 15-year-old Hong Kong boy who lived in Causeway Bay of Hong Kong at the time of the Japanese occupation. He lived with his family of 4.
December 18th. It was supposed to be just an ordinary day. I'd gone to school when the bombs fell on the Kai Tak airport. After the occupation, my life turned around entirely. My school had been closed down and I stopped attending my classes. Almost all the kids in my neighborhood stopped going to school, although there were still some students, including my friend Tommy, whose school hadn't been closed down. However, the policy at those schools had completely changed. Japanese culture, education, and etiquette were instilled, and they even had to start learning Japanese. Tommy, who was 4 years younger in primary school, had to learn the Japanese language for 4 hours every week.
學生數目由1941年大概11萬跌到得返3000個左右啫嘛，即係絕大部分嘅學生係冇返到學嘅，其實佢哋冇得揀嘅。其實嗰個課程話改就改，其實亦都冇問過佢哋，亦都冇問過任何人。基本上日本人嚟到就刪咗一部分學校。好大部分嘅學生俾人趕走咗，咁跟住佢哋就將佢哋嗰啲日本化咗嘅課程就逼佢哋學生去讀。佢哋係有教中文，不過冇教英文咯，教日文咯，即係所有嘅皇文化嘅教育，就將佢哋變成半個日本人又半個中國人咁嘅教育。最主要嗰個 theme 其實就係一個叫東亞主義嘅嘢，叫 Pan-Asianism。咁嗰個嘢其實就係話咩咧？所有亞洲嘅人都應該係合作啊，咁但係咧就用呢個日本人嚟做領袖。咁所以呢一種咁樣嘅教育。
Not only the occupation materially affected the children's lives, but also the women's, leaving them to suffer an indelible humiliation. A few days after Hong Kong's capture, approximately 10,000 women were raped by Japanese soldiers.
性罪行係咪好嚴重？其實只係頭幾個星期啫，係啦，即係日軍嗰個攻陷香港嗰個部隊喺香港留咗3個星期左右。佢嗰3個星期咧個性罪行好嚴重，亦都唔係全香港嘅。有幾個地方嘅啫，其實銅鑼灣啦、灣仔啊、同埋九龍。
Here is the story of a female civilian that fought hard under the harsh conditions of the Japanese occupation. Jean Jittens was born in Hong Kong, the daughter to Sir Robert and Lady Clara Ho Tung. Jean was living a content life with her children and husband Billy, but because of the war, the family separated, the children left to Australia, and Billy became a prisoner of war.
In early 1940, I joined the university in its preparation for war as the secretary to the Dean of Medicine. On Sunday, the 7th of December 1941, the volunteers were called, and I had driven Billy to the headquarters. Little did I realize that I was never to hear his voice again, and the only sight of him would be from behind the barbed wires of a prison camp.
佢將啲英文執晒去個 Stanley Internment Camp 啦，咁冇乜交流可言，佢哋喺裏邊就喺度。
They put some 1,500 non-Chinese men, women and children into part brothel cheap hotels in the poorest sections of town, where accommodation was filthy. Relief came when it was announced that they would be transferred to Stanley. Since my father had claimed his Chinese nationality, I was able to identify myself as a Chinese, which allowed me to stay out of internment for a while. During the first few months, I made many efforts to see Billy. We reached Sham Shui Po camp, and I spotted Billy behind barbed wire fence. There were relatives of other prisoners on the side of the road. Some girls were sobbing quietly, as the guards shouted abuse and threatened to shoot them.
I saw one shoot a Chinese girl who came too near the camp, searching for shellfish along the beach. She lay twitching in the mud for nearly half an hour before he put another bullet through her head.
By this time I was desperate. I had no idea how I was going to live. I was reluctant to seek employment, and I couldn't return home, as my home was already occupied by Japanese officers. All my possessions had been cleared out. With the uncertainty of my outlook, the loss of my home, the heartbreak over my visits to Shamsripo camp, and the hope that Stanley would give me the possibility of an eligible exchange to Australia, I voluntarily entered into a 3.5-year term at Stanley internment camp. We spent terribly cold nights at camp. Mabel, Billy's sister, who lived with her 3 children in one of the flats, slept on the floor during the nights to accommodate her children. There was one bedroom to be shared amongst 35 people. There were a few who firmly believed that they would never live to see the outside world again. Some never did.
The building was now crammed with prisoners of the Japs, white, Chinese, and Indians. The floor literally ran with blood. Most sat huddled in attitudes of despair with their knees drawn up. Here was gathered all the misery of military defeat. There was no food, and worst, no water.
There was little to eat. We were restricted to buying only 240 grams of rice a day. The food were all rationed. Oil, rice, salt, flour. The hunger that we experienced and had to endure is unutterable. During some worst nights, we would share just one piece of bread among the 4 of us. And people who didn't have anything to eat at all, their corpse, starved to death, were seen on the streets. Besides that, there were also a lot of stories of cannibalism, human flesh rumored to be using around in restaurants. It was extremely gruesome.
因為當其時本來戰爭之前咧，就大部分嘅糧食都係來自東南亞同埋廣東省。咁但係戰爭期間咧，廣東省咧就唔再出口乜滯啦，因為廣東省嘅日軍當局同香港嘅日軍當局咧係兩邊係唔啱嘅，即係兩邊係不和嘅。咁所以咧就糧食方面香港就好缺乏。最主要係來自邊度咧？就澳門啦，少部分來自廣東省啦。東南亞基本上全部晒㗎啦。
It's impossible to describe the physical hunger we endured in the days at camp. We were given a pound of rice each day, bad fish, and poor quality vegetables that were often rotten or sodden. Food was served twice a day, once at 2:30 p.m. and then at 4 p.m. The water situation was also dreadful. There was only a dribble of water from the taps, as the Japanese had turned off our main source of water supply at the reservoir in New Territory.